Hi everyone, so today I'm going to talk about some of the things that are related to Lab B in EECS 1021. The first thing is parsing a string into a 2D matrix. So in jShell in the upper left corner you can see that I'm doing some work here where I'm adding in variables, row count and column count, based on the fact that I'm going to want to do a 3x3 matrix. Okay, so 3 rows and 3 columns. And next, I'm going to create a 2D array or 2D matrix variable called myResult. And you can see that it has both rows and columns here. So I'm just highlighting the individual rows. Each has 3 columns. And I'm doing this in jShell. You can get jShell in the terminal or in PowerShell in Windows. Okay, so terminal in Linux or Mac OS, and PowerShell in Windows. I'm going to create a string now. I'm going to call it my number as a string, or my number as string, and I'm going to fill it with a string that has a bunch of numbers in it that are separated by spaces. So this object, my number as string, contains a bunch of spaces, but also a bunch of numbers, but as a single unit. And so we're going to try and figure out how to split that up into individual numbers. Can we do basically a vector or an array of individual strings? And we're going to use the method called split to do that. So I didn't write it out quite right there. But what I want to do is I want to split that original string by identifying the individual spaces between my numbers. I could have used other things to delimit it, like commas or whatever. But anyway, you can see here I've now written it out properly. I use the var keyword to let the split method work and to create basically a vector of strings. Not just a single string, but a vector of strings. Here I'm trying to delimit the original string differently than just spaces, and then split it according to those commas. And sure enough, it works. I have 9 members of split string. Okay, so split string is a vector or an array of individual strings. Next up, I want to do one loop inside of another loop. So I'm going to do 2 for loops, one inside the other. And I'm using jShell right here. And you can see that I'm creating this inner loop. I'm creating the structure for it. All right, so 4 and another 4. And I'm putting in the semicolons where I put in the index, in this case I, starting at 0, and j for my inner for loop. And I'm going to increment each time I go through the loop, doing a single improvement or increment to I and a single one to j each time it goes through that loop, either the outer for loop or the inner one. And I'm going to end each one of those loops before they get to either row count or column count. So now I'm going to work on the inner loop, the body of the inner loop. And notice the curly braces that are used to denote where these loops begin. I have one curly brace for the outer loop and one curly brace for the inner loop that begin those loops. And then I'll add the closing curly braces afterwards. All right, so now I want to set up a double or a 2D array called myResult that has both rows and columns. They're denoted by I and j as indices. And I'm going to use something called integer.parsing parse int. So I'm going to parse for integers. I'm going to split up. Or I'm going to identify, I guess is a better word. I'm going to identify the integers based on the individual strings. I'm going to interpret those strings, okay, and make them into integers. And I'm going to store them in my result. And I use this little equation right here, split string, with I times column count plus j, to go through my for loop. I made a little error there. I gotta add in, looks like I missed a parenthesis. Yeah, that should go right there. And I've got my double curly braces to end it. All right, so my result is there. And it's able to store the individual integers into my result from the vector or the 1D array of strings. And that's how I convert. Parsing a string into a 2D matrix or 2D array. So it's a 3x3 array or a matrix as integers from a 1D string. And that's how I exit jShell. /exit. All right, next up, adding two arrays or matrices together. So I'm going to fire up jShell. You can see my flowchart for the lab on the right and the description of the lab task on the bottom left. In the upper left, I'm going to start my task here. So I'm going to set up an integer array called myMatrix. It's going to be 2 dimensions. You can see the square brackets that denote the 2-dimensionality of it. And I'm going to fill it with values. So first I denote the individual rows, where I'm going to put the individual rows using the curly braces, and I'm going to put more curly braces in to fill those rows with individual columns. So 10 and 20 on the first row, 500 and 600 on the second row. And you can see basically it's a bunch of integers. All right, so here I'm going to say that I've got a number of rows. Based on that original 2D array, I'm going to determine how many rows I have, because sometimes you don't know how much data there is, how many rows and how many columns. So use length. So my variable name, dot length, to figure out how many rows, and then the variable name, and you choose the first row, in this case 0, and you determine its length from there. So you're using basically a method on that variable, okay, on that object. You're determining its characteristics. So number of rows and number of columns. So in object-oriented programming, this is really nice because you can determine the characteristics of objects by using these sort of internal methods, okay? So I want to set up a second matrix. How would I do that? That's not working. I want a second matrix, and I want to say how many rows and how many columns it has. Can we do that? Sure, there we go. I've just duplicated the first matrix. The first array has become a template for the second array. I filled it with the same values. So now I've got two 2D arrays, or two matrices. I need because I'm going to be adding two matrices together, I want to put them into a result matrix or a result 2D array. How would I go about doing that? Could I do it this way? No, that didn't work. Experimenting is a good idea. Getting practice is a good idea. Let's see what we can do here. Ah, there we go. So I needed to put two empty sets of square brackets on the left-hand side of the assignment operator. Okay. So next up, I need to define what kind of operation I want to do. I'm going to define it by a character. So I'm going to do a plus, because I'm going to feed this into a switch case statement. Because maybe I want to do a subtraction or a multiplication or some other operation. So how would I choose what kind of operation I wanted to do? I need a flag or a selection character. So here we go. I've got a character called my math operation, and it's the plus character. And you can see that jShell is telling me what the actual value and name of the variables are. It's something that's a little bit harder to do or not quite as obvious in IntelliJ that. That's why I'm using jShell right here, because it gives me an immediate feedback on what I just did. That's the advantage of jShell. All right. Let's test this out. If I wanted to add two different, without the character, I'm actually going to use the real operation here. If I wanted to add two individual elements from the two different arrays, how would I do it? Oh, and I wanted to assign it to the resulting array or resulting matrix. How would I do it? Ah, okay. You got to make sure that you use the right indices. It's a 2 by 2, so we start it with a count of 0, so you can't actually put the number 2 in there. So here I've chosen just arbitrary elements to add together, and the end result is, as you can see right there, 610. All right, so let's try and do it for all of the elements in both of those arrays. So I'm going to have two different for loops, an outer for loop, which is what I'm dealing with right there, and then an inner for loop with indices controlled by I and j. And then I'm going to say that I need to increment once per loop with I++ and j++. And I want to not exceed the maximum lengths of, or the maximum number of columns, the maximum number of rows. So I'm controlling my rows using the outer for loop. I'm controlling my columns using the inner for loop. All right, so how do I make sure that I don't go past the number of rows and get an out of bounds error? So I want to deal with the length. Okay, so my matrix.length will tell me how many rows I have. But I've already calculated that as num rows. Okay, num columns. You can go either way. But in this case, I actually have variables that are dedicated to each of those values. So number of rows, number of columns are set. And now I have to deal with the inner loop, where I'm going to assign the results into result matrix. I and j is the indices for rows and columns. And I'm going to set up a switch statement. I'm going to switch on that character. Okay? So my math operation, which is a plus character, I'm going to define the case that I switch on for plus. And I say that if a plus occurs, I want to assign the value to result matrix ij from my matrix ij plus my second matrix ij. And the next row I could put in a minus or a multiplication or some other operation if I wanted to. But it's often a really good idea to put a default condition. And often this default condition should be an error. Okay? So this is how we do it in Java. We throw exceptions when there's an error. In this case, we want to say that we had a bad argument. A minus or a multiplication isn't currently defined. Okay, so not a valid operation. So I throw an exception. And this is the illegal argument exception. There are other exceptions that you'll learn about. So there are two different types of switch case statements. This is the newer one in Java. It's less error prone. Now I got to close it up. Don't know where that N came from. I'm going to hit enter and see what happens. All right. So I'm missing something here. What am I missing? I'm looking. Am I missing a parenthesis or a curly brace or a square bracket? Oh, there we go. Needed to have a parenthesis there. My curly braces. No. I'm missing a semicolon. It looks like I need a semicolon somewhere in here. Curly brace, semicolon, curly brace. I think we're good. There we go. So it worked. But I don't see any result. So let's see, can I type in one of the variable names and see if it got filled? So result matrix, did it get filled? And the answer is yes. I can see that the first row and now the second row got filled. Their column values are correct. All right. Next, converting an integer array or matrix to a string for printing to the screen. So we've got to do that at the very end. We can type in the name of the variable in IntelliJ, or we can do it in debug mode, or we can do it in jShell. But the user doesn't get to do that. So we actually have to figure out how to print it as a string to the screen. All right, so we'll start off with in jShell right here in the upper left, we're going to fill in an array called myArray. It's 2D. It has 2 rows and 3 columns, which is different than what I did before. I'm going to use the myArray.length, the length characteristic, to determine how many rows. I'm going to do the same thing for columns by looking at the first row, row 0 of my array. Okay, so next up, I got to figure out how to convert an integer array into a string for printing. So I'm going to define a variable called myOutString, and it's an empty string. That's how I do it right there. Let's just muck around here, make a temporary string. Let's explore it, okay? Let's explore how it works. So I've got an empty string called tempString. I want to add stuff to that string. So I'm going to try and use the concat or concatenation method. So tempString.concat, open parenthesis, I'm going to put a space, and then 1, 2, 3. That's 2 different strings added together and added to the original tempString. Okay, that works, but tempString was empty to begin with. Let's add some more to it. So you see I added space 1, 2, 3, and then I added space 4, 5, 6. And it created a single string called tempString with those things concatenated to it. That's basically what we want to do here, but we also are going to want to add a new line in order to get a 2D printout when I do system.out.println. So I'm going to do a for loop, and there are cleaner ways of doing this, but based on your background in MATLAB or another programming language from before, doing a double for loop like this, the procedural way, is pretty straightforward. It's a little verbose, but it works. So a for loop to control rows and a for loop to control columns. I'm using indices I and j. They're integers to iterate through those two for loops. And I don't want to exceed the number of rows, and I don't want to exceed the number of columns. So I use num rows and num columns, which I've defined earlier, using the length characteristic on my array. And that's a good way of doing it when you don't know a priori, beforehand, ahead of time, what the number of columns and rows are going to be. So I'm saying that I don't want to go past the number of rows or the number of columns, and I have to set up an iteration on j and an iteration on I right there. All right. So I'm going to end up filling my out string in this for loop right here. I'm just cleaning up my little comment right there. Okay, so how do I assign? How am I going to do this assignment with a concatenation? So I do my out string is equal to my out string dot concat. And when you see the thing jump around like that when I'm typing in concat, I hit tab in order to try and get completion on it. All right. So concat space plus myArray ij. Let's see if this works. Oh, right. I got to do integer.parse. Right? No, integer to string. Is that going to work? Yeah. It's to string. There you go. Sorry, it's the other way. I convert my integer into a string. All right. I think I've got enough parentheses here. I got to close it up. The curly brace and then another curly brace. Oh, sorry. I got to put in the new line. That's right. So after I'm done with all the columns in a single row, I have to add in or concatenate a new line. So open double quote /n close double quote. That's right, I forgot the new line. There's the new line right there. All right, now I close the curly brace. And that should work. There we go, no errors. And I'm going to type in my out string to see if it filled in. Excellent, you can see the new line at the end of each row. Now can we print it using system.out.print? We could do print line or we could do print. Let's do print. Actually, it doesn't really matter. Let's do it like that, print line. And there you go, there you have it. It's not pretty, but it works.